The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October, while I was pulling weeds from the garden beds I had planted 26 years ago when we first moved into this house. My hands were dirty. My knees ached the way they always do now when I kneel too long, and the late autumn sun was warm on the back of my neck. I remember all of that with strange precision. The way you remember the details of the moment before everything changes. My husband's voice on the other end sounded almost cheerful. He said he had news. He said the deal had finally closed. He said Whitmore Industrial had officially purchased his manufacturing company for $2.8 million, and that after 38 years of marriage, he thought it was time for both of us to start fresh. Separately, he said he had already spoken to a lawyer. I was still holding a clump of crabgrass in my gloved hand when I understood what he was telling me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the garden I had loved and tended since our children were small. And I thought, he planned this. He had been planning this before he ever told me the company was for sale. Let me tell you who I am first, because I think it matters. My name is Dorothy. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years working as a registered nurse, mostly in cardiac care, before I retired 3 years ago when my knees made 12-hour shifts impossible. I am not a dramatic woman. I have never in my life considered myself someone to whom dramatic things happen. I raised 2 children in this house, watched my husband build a small business from a leased warehouse and 2 employees into something real, supported us through the lean years when the business nearly folded twice, and returned to work full-time both times to keep us afloat while he rebuilt. I thought we had built something together. I thought that was the whole point. My husband and I met in Austin in 1986. He was 28 and I was 26, and he had a laugh that filled whatever room he walked into. We got married the following spring in my mother's backyard. Our daughter was born 14 months later, and our son 2 years after that. We were not rich people. We were careful people, the kind who clip coupons and drive cars until they fail completely and take their vacations within driving distance. But we were stable. And I thought we were happy, or at least content in the way that long marriages often settle into contentment. I stopped looking too closely at what was underneath it. I should have looked. I found out later, from our daughter, that my husband had been seeing a woman from his accounting firm for almost 2 years. She was 41. I am not going to pretend that didn't cut me somewhere deep, but what cut deeper, if I'm being honest, was not the affair itself. It was the timeline. 2 years. He had been sitting across from me at the dinner table, sleeping in our bed, going on our grandson's birthday trips to the beach, all while building a separate life and waiting for the moment the business sale closed so he could walk away clean. He had been patient about it. Methodical. I didn't see it because I wasn't looking, and I wasn't looking because it never occurred to me that the man I had spent 38 years building a life with was quietly dismantling it behind my back. He moved out 2 weeks after the phone call. He said he would give me time to find somewhere else to live. He said it generously. The way you might speak to a tenant who needs extra notice, not the way you speak to the woman who painted every room in that house and planted every tree in that yard, and brought both your children home from the hospital to that front door. I did not find somewhere else to live. I sat down at the kitchen table instead and I made a list. I wrote down everything I knew about our finances, every account I was aware of, the deed to the house, the retirement accounts, the investment accounts we had opened together in the 1990s. I wrote down what I knew about the business sale, and then I looked at what I had written and I tried to think clearly, which is the hardest thing to do when your chest feels like something is sitting on it. My daughter drove up from San Antonio that same weekend. She sat with me at that same kitchen table and she held both my hands across it and she cried in a way that I did not let myself cry, not yet. She said, "Mom, you cannot let him do this to you. She said, "You spent 38 years in this marriage." She said, "Please get a lawyer." I told her I already had someone in mind. I want to be clear about something. The house was in both our names. Everything we owned had been built during our marriage. With both our incomes, including the years I worked double shifts so the business could survive. In Texas, that matters. What two people build together during a marriage belongs to both of them. What I didn't know yet was how hard he had worked to make sure I couldn't touch as much of it as the law intended. The lawyer I called was a woman named Susan. My daughter's friend had used her in a difficult divorce 3 years earlier and had come out the other side with her dignity and her retirement intact. Susan was in her mid-50s, small and precise, with reading glasses she took on and off throughout our first meeting, and a way of listening that made me feel like every word I said was being carefully filed away and would be used in exactly the right moment. She did not rush. She did not soften things unnecessarily. She looked at my list, asked me a series of questions I had not thought to ask myself, and then she leaned back in her chair and said, "I think there's more here than you know about. Let's find out what." She brought in a forensic accountant. His name was Martin, and he was quiet and methodical in a way I found deeply comforting, the same way I used to find comfort in the methodical work of monitoring a patient's vitals. He was looking for numbers that didn't add up, and within 3 weeks, he had found them. My husband had sold his company for $2.8 million. That much was true. What he had not told me was that over the preceding 18 months, he had been quietly moving money. A consulting fee here, a repaid loan there, funds redirected to an account held jointly with our son under the pretense of helping him purchase a second property. It looked complicated on paper. Martin told me it was not actually that complicated once you knew what you were looking for. What it looked like, he said carefully, was a deliberate effort to reduce the marital estate before the divorce proceedings began. I remember sitting in Susan's office when Martin walked us through what he had found, and I felt something move through me that I can only describe as cold. Not grief. Grief I had already been doing quietly in the kitchen at night when no one was there to see it. This was something else. This was the recognition of how fully I had been underestimated. He had looked at me for 38 years, this man, and he had seen someone who would not look closely, someone who trusted, someone who would take the apartment and be grateful for the extra months of notice and sign whatever papers were put in front of her. He was wrong. The legal process was not fast. I want to say that plainly because I think people expect these things to resolve quickly, and they do not. There were months of filings and counterfilings, of my husband's lawyer arguing that the transfers were legitimate, of depositions where I sat across a table from my husband for the first time since he had left and watched him look at a point just past my shoulder rather than at my face. Our son, to his credit, was horrified when the full picture emerged. He had believed the account was genuinely for his property purchase. He cooperated fully with Martin's investigation and provided every document requested. He called me afterward and cried and said he was sorry, and I told him there was nothing to forgive. Because there wasn't. Not where he was concerned. My daughter came to every hearing. She sat behind me in the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her jaw set. And every time I turned around, she gave me the same small nod. The one that means, "I see you. Keep going." I kept going. There were nights that were very hard. I won't pretend otherwise. 38 years is most of your adult life, and even when you are furious at someone, even when you understand clearly that they deceived you, you still grieve the life you thought you had. I grieved it in the garden, mostly. I kept planting things. I planted a whole bed of salvia that fall, and a row of Mexican sage along the back fence, and I found that the work of putting something in the ground and tending it was the only thing that reliably quieted the noise in my head. My neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Beverly, who has lived next door for 20 years, brought me soup twice a week without being asked, and never once tried to make me talk about my feelings when I didn't want to. I am grateful for her in a way I don't have words for. Susan and I talked strategy every 2 weeks. She was honest with me about the range of possible outcomes. In the best case, she said, if we could demonstrate that the asset transfers were intentional and fraudulent, the judge could set them aside entirely and divide the full estate. In a more moderate outcome, we would recover a significant portion. She told me not to expect a perfect result, because the law is not a perfect instrument. But she also told me not to accept less than what I was owed. I told her I had no intention of accepting less than what I was owed. The hearing that mattered most came on a gray Wednesday in March. I wore the navy blazer my daughter had pressed for me the night before. I sat next to Susan, and I kept my hands still in my lap, and I looked at the judge, not at my husband, and I listened. My husband's lawyer argued that the transfers were legitimate business transactions, that the money moved to our son's account represented a bona fide loan repayment, that my husband had acted in good faith throughout. He was composed and well prepared, and I could see why my husband had hired him. Martin's documentation was better. He had traced every transfer, cross-referenced every date, demonstrated the timeline in a way that was methodical and undeniable. The transfers had begun 22 months before the divorce filing. They had accelerated in the 8 months before the business sale closed. The pattern was not one of ordinary financial management. The pattern, Martin explained in the even, precise voice he always used, was consistent with systematic asset concealment prior to a dissolution of marriage. The judge was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses, not unlike Susan's. She read through the documentation herself. She asked several clarifying questions. She gave my husband's lawyer adequate opportunity to respond. Then she ruled. The business sale proceeds were marital property. The funds transferred to our son's account over the preceding 2 years were to be returned to the marital estate for division. Given evidence of deliberate concealment, she was awarding me 55% of the total marital assets, including the family home, which would transfer to my name alone. My husband would receive 45%, reduced from the standard 50%, to reflect his bad faith conduct during the proceedings. I heard Susan exhale quietly beside me. I kept my hands still in my lap, and I looked at the judge and I nodded once, the way you nod when someone has said something that is simply correct. My husband looked older than I remembered when he stood up from his table across the room. He did not look at me. He walked out with his lawyer, and I watched him go, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, which was almost nothing. Not triumph, exactly. Not satisfaction in the way I had imagined it would feel. Just a quiet, settled sense that the truth had been the truth all along. And it had simply taken a few months and a very good forensic accountant to make it visible to everyone else. My daughter was the first one to reach me. She didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me in the hallway of the courthouse and held on. And after a moment, I let myself cry. Finally, for the first time since October. Not for my husband, not even for the 38 years. Not exactly. Just for the woman who had been standing in her garden pulling weeds when the world she thought she lived in turned out to be something else entirely. I cried for her, and then I stopped. The house took 8 weeks to transfer into my name alone. I watched the paperwork process with a focus I had never before applied to legal documents. Reading every page, asking Susan to explain every term I didn't fully understand. I was not going to sign anything again without understanding it. I was done with trust that wasn't earned. The morning the transfer was finalized, I went out to the garden early. Before Beverly came over, before my daughter called, before anyone else knew, I walked the perimeter of the yard the way I used to walk the perimeter of my unit at the beginning of a shift. Quietly checking on everything, noting what was well and what needed attention. The salvia I had planted in October had come in beautifully. The Mexican sage along the back fence was starting to bloom. The oak tree in the corner, the one we had planted when our son was born, was 32 years old now and enormous, and it had nothing to do with my husband, and nothing to do with the divorce, and everything to do with the ordinary, faithful work of tending something over decades until it becomes something you couldn't have imagined when you started. I sat down on the garden bench, and I looked at everything I had made. The money I received in the settlement was more than I had expected, even after everything. I put most of it into accounts. I managed myself, in my name alone. On the advice of a financial planner, my daughter found for me a woman, also in her 60s, who spoke to me like an adult and not like someone who needed to be managed. I kept enough liquid to make some improvements to the house that I had wanted to make for years, but had always deferred to my husband's opinion on. New windows in the kitchen. The back porch finally screened in. A proper raised bed, vegetable garden, along the south fence where the light was good. I am not going to tell you the transition was easy. I am 64 years old, and I lived inside a particular life for 38 years. And even a life that ends badly leaves grooves in you that take time to fill with something else. There are evenings that are harder than others. There are moments when I set the table for one, and I feel the size of the house more than I want to. I do not pretend those moments don't exist. But here is what else exists. Beverly and I have coffee on her porch 3 mornings a week, and she makes me laugh more reliably than anyone I have met in years. My daughter visits every 6 weeks, and we have gotten in the habit of cooking together on Saturday evenings, trying recipes we've never attempted, making a mess of the kitchen, and not caring. My son and I talk on the phone every Sunday. My grandson is 7 now, and he spent a week with me last summer, and we planted sunflowers together along the front walk. And he told me, with complete seriousness, that he intended to become a gardener when he grew up. I told him it was excellent work. And I want to say something directly to anyone who might be listening to this story and recognizing something in it. Not necessarily the details, which are mine alone, but the feeling underneath them. The feeling of having trusted someone completely, of having made a life with them, of having given them the better part of your energy and your years, and then discovering that what you trusted was not entirely what you thought. If you are in that feeling right now, I want you to hear this. Do not leave the house. Do not sign anything. Do not let anyone manage your grief and your legal situation at the same time, because they are 2 separate things and they require 2 separate kinds of attention. Find someone methodical and honest to sit beside you in the legal part. Let yourself grieve the human part in your own time and your own way. And know this: 38 years of marriage, 31 years of nursing, a house and a garden and a family that loves you. None of that disappears when a man decides he wants something else. It is still yours. The law understands that. Even when the man in question is hoping you won't find out. In time. I found out in time. The house is mine. The garden is mine. The oak tree my son was born under is mine. And it is 32 years old. And it is not going anywhere. Neither am I. Thank you for listening. If this story reached you in some way, if you saw something of yourself or someone you love in it, I hope you'll leave a comment below. And if you know someone who might need to hear it, please share it with them. I'll be back next week with another story, because as it turns out, I have more to say than I ever expected.